Part 3. What happened to Palestine after the fall of the Ottoman Empire? And the British mistakes.
In World War I, the Ottoman Empire, who joined Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire and Bulgaria against the Allied powers, fell. The United Allies, known as the League of Nations at the time and now known as the United Nations, throughout the war took control of the lands which made up the Ottoman Empire, with many regions in the Middle East being put under the control of Britain and France. Britain now controlled the region which was formerly Israel, before its name changed to Palestine, and was now known as British Mandatory Palestine, and was under the British flagship. All the regions previously within the Ottoman Empire were calling for their sovereignty as states in their own right, specifically religious-focused Islamic states, and the majority were granted this. The Middle East over time became split, and the right of sovereignty and control was given independently to the majority Arab populations in each region, what is now 22 Arab Islamic state countries. However, whilst many of these Islamic states were given sovereignty, the area which was at the time known as British Mandatory Palestine, which had never had its own sovereignty since it was Israel and a Jewish state, had not yet been officially recognized as its own state. During the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the United Allies were negotiating with the Arab regions to turn against their rulers of the Ottoman Empire to help their victory, and did so by promising them independence. Palestine did not have any other remaining historical independent rule specific to just the region of Palestine, since it was its own sovereign Jewish state. As such, they didn't have their own recognized leadership. More so on account of the land rights at this time were mostly owned by vacant landlords from other regions, mainly Egypt and Syria. So, during these negotiations, the Arab leaders surrounding Palestine presumed this offer of exchange of support against the Ottomans for sovereignty encompassed Palestine, as many of these leaders had people who owned part of the land. But they were not specifically told Palestine would be given in its own right sovereignty, separate to the other Arab regions. Naturally, a number of the Arabs in Palestine presumed from this they would have their own sovereignty also, whilst other leaderships in regions such as Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon and Syria presume they will encompass some of the areas within Palestine. It is a bit confusing and cryptic, with nothing at the time being definitive in regard to the area. However, during this confusion, Britain promised France and the other allies that Palestine would be under international control for the foreseeable future. Many Arabs make the claim that Palestine was promised first at this period by the British before the end of the war, on account of letters exchanged between Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, and the British. In the letters, Hussein, on discussing the regions to be made sovereign, referenced the area of the land to the west of Damascus, Syria, which can be presumed to mean Palestine, but not explicitly stating Palestine. Regardless of this dispute, the fact is the letters were about the Arabs supporting the Allied nations against the Ottomans, and the price for their support. Hussein represented a large amount of Arab Muslim communities, and many did fight for the Allied nations against the Ottomans, and these areas were granted sovereignty. However, the majority of the Arabs in Palestine did not fight for the Allied nations, and actually fought for the Ottomans, especially those who identified themselves as Syrian Arabs who lived in Palestine. This point makes any disputed claim surrounding the letters exchanged before the end of the war null and void. They never fulfilled their side of the discussion, and in any way, the letters never reached a conclusion before the end of the war. This was the first mistake by the British, whereby not giving clarity over this point to the Arabs, which began what we now see as the modern day conflict, already starting the situation with confusion. Whilst these general promises were being given to many Arab regions, as the Allies took more control of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of Zionism was ongoing, hand in hand with the rise of anti-Semitism. More Jews were being forced to flee their adopted homes across Europe, and also Arab regions, and many with no place to go decided to finally come back to the land from which they were indigenous to. While the Arabs were putting in requests to split up the Ottoman Empire into individual Islamic states, the leader of the Zionists also put in a request for the right to sovereignty in British Mandatory Palestine and to be returned to being a Jewish state. The British, upon victory over the Ottomans at the end of the war, attempted what they deemed as a diplomatic approach, and after noticing the rise of anti-Semitism, the decree of most of the Arab regions becoming independent Islamic states, and the fact Palestine was only ever a Jewish state when it was last independent, they sympathized with the Zionist claims and granted them permission to claim Palestine as a sovereign Jewish state in 1917. This is the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration reads as such: Dear Lord Rothschild, a Zionist leader, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by the Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. There are many who dispute the legal legitimacy of the letter, on account of the letter being produced prior to Britain officially taking full legal mandatory control of all of Palestine. However, in the mandatory legal documents put together and signed with the United Nations in 1923, it specifically refers to acknowledging the Balfour Declaration, making it a legal binding agreement that Britain should support in Palestine becoming an established Jewish state. As the letter states, it was never the intention of the Zionist movement to remove or segregate any of the people that inhabited the land which were not Jewish. The land of Palestine at this time was around 10% Jewish as a result of more Jewish refugees fleeing back to the land after being cast out of their homes due to the rise of nationalism and anti-Semitism everywhere. The proposals agreed were surrounding the right for it to be under a Jewish state, meaning in essence the national calendars and holidays will follow the Jewish practices, and the right for those Jews who set up homes outside of Palestine due to the historic exiles and forced purgatory have the right to return safely to the land. You could argue that as a minority population that they shouldn't have been given this right, but that disregards the anti-Semitism, the fact that Jews live where they did due to exile and purgatory, not due to unprovoked independent choice, and it disregards the fact that hundreds of thousands of Jews lived across all Arab nations which have now been given the right to sovereignty as Islamic states. The population of Jews in the Ottoman Empire across the Middle East and North Africa equated to around 1%. So where the Muslims were asking for land to be split up as Islamic states, if it was equally split to match the populations on religious grounds, then the Jews should be entitled to 1% of the land in theory. However, the land at this point, now known as British Mandatory Palestine, equates to being only 0.2% of the land which were to become Islamic states. So how did the Arab Muslims respond to this? When this declaration was announced, understandably many Arab leaders were disgruntled. They believed they were promised all lands, despite no promise was specific about Palestine as an independent state, or even how it would look. Many Arabs believed the region will be absorbed into the areas of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Some believed it was to have large parts of Palestine being absorbed by all, but a part of it will remain to be independent. And some local Arabs in the Palestine region believed they would have independence. It was a very grey area, but one point the Arab leaders did make, which was extremely valid, was that the inhabitants of Palestine were not actually consulted. Only those of other regions where some thought they will absorb Palestine. This was the second mistake which the British made to contribute to the modern day issues. Following this point made by the Arab leaders, the Zionist leaders were told by the British to go to the region to explain their aspirations with all. And so they did. The results were mixed. A large proportion of the Arab leaders the Zionist leaders spoke to agreed that the Jews had a legitimate claim of right to return and be a Jewish state. But this didn't mean they agreed for it to happen, only that they had a legitimate claim, and questioned if their claim should supersede their own. Another good point made by some Arab leaders was made highlighting the third mistake by the British. This was that they questioned why they were only greeted by the Zionist leaders and were without the presence of the British leaders to support the aspiration claims being brought to them. As the Zionists went on explaining their aspirations to the Arab leaders, the results presented were as such. Some agreed in the aspiration claim and had no argument against the Jews to have the right to return and for the region to be a Jewish state. What may be surprising to some in recent times is predominantly it was the leaders in Lebanon which showed no issues and supported the claims. Other leaders agreed to the right of return and for Palestine to change to being a Jewish state once again, but raised some concerns. The main one being that they thought if there was to be declared a Jewish state, that it would increase the anti-Semitism in other regions, as countries will know the Jews will have somewhere else to go, and so may increase the amount of people forcing them to leave. This point was referenced in the Balfour Declaration as something to look to prevent upon the formation of a Jewish state. This was a very legitimate concern, but one which didn't provide a solution to the existing anti-Semitism and the Jews being left without a home they could call their own without prejudice. Others agreed the Jews had a legitimate claim, but believed the land should be an Islamic state nonetheless, and right of return should be denied, stating the claim that the Jews only covered 10% of the population and the majority are Muslims in British Mandatory Palestine, so it should be an Islamic state. But again, this raises the argument that Jews still existed across all the Arab regions, and their beliefs were ignored when the regions they were in became sovereign Islamic states. What was also stated in regard to this point is the accusation that the Jews as well as the Christians, already living in the land, have lived under a Muslim regime in peace, so why disrupt the status quo? This statement of them living in peace under the Muslim rule since the first caliphate conquered and colonized the region is not exactly true. For the Jews and Christians to remain in the lands taken over by the caliphate, they were given 4 choices. 1. Convert to Islam. 2. Fight for the caliphate army, killing many other Christians and Jews in order to convert their lands to Islamic regime, or in certain regions to give the firstborn son to the caliphate for them to be converted to Islam and fight for the caliphate, which was called the blood tax. Or 3. Remain a minority and pay higher taxes than the other Muslim civilians, and they weren't allowed jobs in government. Or lastly 4. Die. Over the centuries closer to 1917, the Ottomans relaxed these rules to a degree. This was in regard to the point to fight for the caliphate, where the blood tax was ended, and now saw everyone, including Muslims, pay an extra tax if they chose to not join the caliphate army. Also, the rule regarding not allowing non-Muslims jobs in government, this remained true in regard to the Muslim government, which was the overarching court and government of the empire. However, those of non-Muslim backgrounds could appoint their own leaders and operate courts for their own people in regard to internal community disputes, which did not affect Islamic law or involve any Muslims. But any crime or accusation which involved Muslims or went against Islamic law was still under the jurisdiction of only Muslims, with no non-Muslims allowed in governing or court positions. It is beyond exaggeration to state Jews and Christians lived in peace under these circumstances in sense of equality and freedom. Those who were non-Muslim throughout the Caliphate's histories were treated differently and followed extra laws and restrictions. If the non-Muslims followed these rules, then yes, you could say they could live in peace. But that is the same as saying, if the black South African populations followed all rules whilst under the South Africa apartheid regime, then they mostly lived in peace. It's a very skewed definition of peace. Take Hebron for instance, where Abraham was buried, a holy place to the Jews for obvious reasons. When the Muslim Caliphate conquered these regions and so the region became a majority Islamic, even the Jews who had always remained in Hebron were now not allowed to visit Abraham's tomb. If they were found to climb higher than the 7th step of the entrance, they were punished by death. This was similar to the Jewish Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the holiest place to the Jews. This had been knocked down by the Romans, but Jews still visited the ruins to pray until the Caliphate took control. The Muslims built the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the ruins of the Temple Mount and decreed that any non-Muslims found on its grounds would be punished by death. Even today, where Israel now occupy all of Jerusalem, in an effort to try to keep the peace between Jews and Muslims, it is an Israeli state law that no non-Muslim can pray on the grounds still. Many Jews have since attempted to pray in secret on the grounds, and all caught doing so have been arrested. The Jews instead are only allowed to pray next to the western wall, in the area next to the mosque, a wall which used to be part of the Temple Mount surroundings, but to the west and below the now present Al-Aqsa Mosque. The discussions between the Arab and Zionist leaders were ongoing, and in addition to the statements already given, other Arab leaders completely rejected the Zionist aspirations, saying it's ridiculous to base an aspiration on claims of the land being a home to their people when the people haven't had a majority in the land for over 1,000 years. But what this point doesn't state is what is the figure of years to pass by, which point you denounce the claim to ever return to your home that you were forced to leave by those threatening death and had already killed many of your kin. Is it 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, or even 1,000? Can you put a timestamp on it? And if so, how do you determine that timestamp? It's an extremely grey area and will never have an exact answer, to which only brings further argument and division if you deny that it is the Jews' original home and only place where they previously could practice their customs and traditions without prejudice for a time. The discussions and debates continued, and many of the Arab leaders also raised concern, stating that the region is small and cannot cope with the state if all the Jews came back to live there. The country would not be able to accommodate them all, and all non-Jews would be forced to leave. This last point was on a specific perception of the land in its state at the time, and did not acknowledge its potential. This is because the majority of the region now as British Mandatory Palestine mostly had land rights owned by vacant landlords not living in the land who left the land to fall to ruin. Most of the regions were now just desert, and most of the unoccupied more fertile lands became overgrown marshlands full of malaria, so were deemed to be uninhabitable. What also wasn't mentioned when the points were raised about the Jews being a minority to the land was how the Muslims in recent years actually became a larger majority, and how their ancestors were never connected to the land. Around the mid-19th century, more internal disputes between secular Muslims and extreme religious Muslims occurred, often turning to violence. As a result, many Arab Muslims from surrounding regions of Palestine fled to Palestine. They used the last of their assets to purchase lands from vacant owners, and the majority lived in a life full of debt and poverty. The majority of Arabs, which after this time lived in the land, and by the time of the Balfour Declaration, were only 1 to 2 generations deep in inhabiting the land, maximum 3. Most of the communities, whether they were Jewish, Christian, Arab, Muslim, or other, were scattered into small areas mostly along the coastline and around Jerusalem. The rest of the land was virtually empty. This point on the size of the land, however, still owned a level of legitimacy in part. The region was small, and there were millions of Jews all over the world. The Zionist leaders took this on board and proposed safety guards to this. They firstly reiterated what the teaching of the land is meant to represent in their culture, That is to be in essence a safe haven for Jews, but to live side by side with those of non-Jewish beliefs, with peace and without prejudice. This point is stated in the Balfour Declaration. The second measure the Zionist leaders proposed was to apply restrictions to immigration. They would look to develop the country into a thriving economy which could accommodate more, and they will impose restrictions to the numbers of immigrants to match that of the available unoccupied land and the levels the economy can accommodate without the non-Jewish population ever suffering or feeling a need to leave. You may be thinking a land the size of British Mandatory Palestine, even with the enhanced development, may still struggle to accommodate all Jews without it turning into slums and people living on top of one another. But that ignores the fact not all Jews would choose to leave their adopted homes to return to Israel, and depends on how many Jews you believe to actually exist in the world. At this point in time, there were not hundreds of millions of Jews, as a lot of people around the world seem to believe. There weren't even 50 million Jews. There were only around 15 million. Even today, with high birth rate numbers, there are only around 16 million Jews in the world. This is largely in part due to the radical ethnic cleansing attempts by the Nazis in World War II, where 6 million Jews were killed, wiping out 40% of the global Jewish population. But having said this, and even with the proposed immigration measures, many of the Arab leaders still refused these proposals. During these discussions, anti-Semitism everywhere was still on the rise, and more Jews were looking for new homes. Alongside this, many Arab Muslim communities in the surrounding regions started to treat their Jewish populations differently. A key example of this was Syria. From the early 1900s, Syria started to impose on their Jewish communities clear apartheid regimes. They denied them the right to work in certain roles, declared that if a Jew dies, then all their possessions and properties will become property of the state and cannot be passed to their family members, regardless of if this left the family members without a home or not. They also denied the Jews the right to leave the country, while Arab Muslims killed many of them. Some Jews found ways to flee in secret to other countries, mainly Lebanon, Latin America, USA, and to the region of Palestine or Israel. There were periods where Syria lifted its travel ban and allowed Jews to leave, but these often lasted for days to weeks before being reversed, and the Jews were again stuck, needing to hide from those that hunted them. Many covert operations occurred to try to smuggle the Jews out to safety, and this continued on until the late 90s, early 2000s. There were over 200,000 Jews in the late 19th century in Syria, and now today there are 0. Syria has been entirely ethnically cleansed of Jews. This was probably the most drastic example of what happened. However, similar aspects happened all over and were pretty close. And with the rise of Zionism, many of the Jews who fled persecution went to British Mandatory Palestine, as they believed they would be finally safe to return. This was not exactly true though. It was not safe.